Welcome to this new series where we'll be taking an in-depth look at all lores of magic and see how their spells perform, what's hit and what's miss. Auto-include or skip? You'll find out. I'll rate all spells based on how good they are in single player, head-to-head multiplayer campaign, and classic multiplayer. Also, this is the beginning of my big Tomb King guide series, so without further interruption, welcome to the Lore of Nehekhara. Let's just see how good this divine magic really is. Let's start with the passive attribute, the Restless Dead. Every time you cast a spell from the Lore of Nehekhara, a map-wide heal of up to 56 health over 7 seconds affects only your undead units with a chance of raise and falling models. It prioritizes healing over resurrecting, but it will start resurrecting once a model is fully healed. So Tomb King healing is a mess in general, as the Realm of Souls does not heal crumbling units. If this ever gets changed, things will get a fair amount better. Meanwhile, the Restless Dead is here to stay, and it's here to help you out a little bit. On its own, it won't do much, but due to the short cooldown of most of the spells in the lore, this passive heal can have a pretty decent uptime during a battle and make all the difference, especially in single player and head-to-head campaigns, as Tomb Kings are one of the most dominant factions for magic gameplay. As you'll see in my next guide. You can easily play multicaster lists with insane power reserves map-wide and just keep your army alive through this passive thanks to super short cooldowns on some spells once they're fully upgraded. You just can't avoid it in single player, can't avoid it in multiplayer, you are not leaving your house, or better said pyramid, without this. Final verdict? 3 out of 3 skulls. The first spell on the list, Djaf's Incantation of Cursed Blades. It's named after the jackal-headed god of war and death, and appropriately enough, it is an offensive buff. This spell is an amazing, cheap buff that affects one target with a duration of 25 seconds. For 3 wins of magic baseline, it gives a 25% increase in both types of weapon damage. Overcasting it for 5 base, or 4 when you upgrade it on the campaign, will give you an additional 16 bonus versus large. The spell has a 28-second cooldown after it runs out, so it's got a fairly decent uptime. And what makes it even crazier, after you max it out on the campaign, its cost goes to 2, and its cooldown goes to 14 for the base version, so it becomes a spam city. It's an extremely straightforward buff spell, but what are the best uses of this incantation? Buffing your super strong lords, heroes, or single entity monsters like Tomb Scorpions for single entity assassination. Buffing Necropolis Knights, buffing Ptra to cleave infantry even harder, buffing Chariots for that sweet perfect rear charge, or using it on cooldown to trigger the Restless Dead. Oh wait, there's one more thing you can do. You can also be a maniac like me and buff mercenary Mournfang cavalry and watch everything get destroyed to pieces. Yeah, that also works. It's just really good for its price, and there are no downsides unless you count not having an AoE overcast version as downside, but then again, that would increase its cost by quite a bit. Guaranteed auto-include into every matchup. Final verdict. Amazing everywhere. Take it. No excuse. 3 out of 3 skulls. The next spell on our list is Neru's Blessing of Protection. It's another cheap spell in the lore with a base cost of 6. It gives a 40% physical damage resistance for 18 seconds on a 30-second cooldown. You thought this was good, right? On the campaign, it gets a 4 cost with a 15-second cooldown once you're fully researched it. Overcasting for 10 wins base, it just doubles the duration to 36 seconds. So, the base version is extremely useful for protecting your important characters or elite units, but mind you, this is worthless against spells or magic attacks. One aspect of the Dread Knight from the enemy or a fireball and you're just smoked. The Overcast version has the downside of costing a little bit too much for a base duration increase. A lot of the times an 18-second buff will be enough to decide combat, plus it'll put the spell on a longer cooldown, which in turn will prevent you from getting more Restless Dead procs off. On the campaign, it does eventually get cheaper to overcast with 8 wins, and then it can be worth it if you're swimming in winds of magic, and don't worry, you'll find that out soon, but it still has the cooldown issue, which drops to 30. If you can consider this a downside, it doesn't have an AoE version like a lot of other protection spells in the game when overcast, but it's just another one of those Lore of Nehekhara quirks, so it is what it is. What are the best uses? Protecting your win condition characters and units, and triggering the Restless Dead. All in all, it's a cheap spell that can always help in a battle, and when it comes to multiplayer, it's pretty much an auto-pick into every matchup, just be careful when timing it. Final verdict? Take it everywhere, all the time, no excuse, 3 out of 3 skulls. And now we have Ptra's Incantation of Smiting. This is an absolutely awesome buff that's worthy of the creator god's name. It's a disgusting buff if you're using ranged units as your win condition both on single player and multiplayer, so now let me fill you in. It's got a 32-second duration with a 43-second cooldown. It affects one target, and for 6 wins, it gives a massive increase in missile damage. On its own, it sounds insane for buffing something like Chosen of the Gods or a fully upgraded Casket of the Souls, right? But a 10 wins overcast will give it an extra 40 reload skill, so let's say your Chosen of the Gods will end up having a 3.3 second reload time. They will machine gun down just about any threat on the enemy army, and don't even talk about hypothetical dodging or accuracy issues or whatever. Chosen of the Gods with this buff will annihilate most of the things in the game, even some lords before they come close to you. And don't even get me started when Great Bow Usekph are min-maxed on the campaign, which you will see in a pretty specific, pretty big guide coming soon. Did I hype you up for this spell? Well, surprise! When fully upgraded on the campaign, it costs drops to 4 base with a 21-second cooldown and 8 to overcast with the same old 43-second cooldown. Never use this to trigger Realm of Souls if your ranged units are in a bad spot and won't get any value from this. Now, what are the best targets? Chosen of the Gods or Usekph in general for multi-purpose destruction, Bone Giant for sniping artillery pieces and large entities, and some smaller ones. Fully upgraded Casket of the Souls in the campaign. They can have over 3.4k missile strength with this buff. I'm just saying, think about that for a moment. At the end of the day, the only downside is the classic Lore of Nehekhara problem. It's no AoE effect. Use it wisely on a key ranged unit and preferably overcast when you can, as that really makes a giant difference. When it comes to multiplayer, this spell is worth taking when you have Usekph as one of your win conditions and the enemy has a disgusting threat that needs to be dealt with quickly, but mind you, it's always going to be map and matchup specific. I would say this can be an automatic pick on larger maps with Chosen of the Gods, Bone Giant, or regular Usekph, but it'll drop somewhat in usefulness on smaller maps or against rush matchups. Final verdict, must bring on campaign, must bring on multiplayer campaign, and usually bring it in multiplayer, so I would say 2.5 skulls. Now we finally have our first damaging spell of the lore, Usirian's Incantation of Vengeance. So it affects one target for 24 seconds, during which they're slowed by 25% and take constant damage with a resist chance. So what can this spell do for a base 11 wins and a 38-second cooldown? Well, it's absolutely devastating against high model count units. It's viable against everything from Djaf to elite infantry. As an example, it'll do anywhere from 1600 to 1900 damage to Great Weapon Chaos Warriors or around 2000 to Foot Squires. Low tier units with big model counts like Ungors take anywhere from 2000 to 2,300, or Marauders taking around 1900 to 2000 on average. This is an extremely helpful spell against key infantry threats. It's also decent against cavalry to an extent where it'll do around 900 to 1100 damage to heavily armored cavs such as Chaos Knights. Now, this is absolutely terrible against low model count units. If you're casting this in lords, chariots, or monstrous infantry for the damage, you're doing something wrong. The overcast version costs 15 wins or 13 when you upgrade it, and it only increases the speed debuff to 45%. In general, you should always use the base version on threatening infantry with one exception. You're trying to pin down an extremely important single entity, and you want to give it no chance of escaping. You overcast and try to surround it with heavy mass units and you just watch it die. All in all, it's a great spell in the Tomb King's arsenal. Used correctly, it just may turn a battle in your favor, not only for the damage but also for the slow utility. Things become even crazier on the campaign as the spell gets to cost only 9 for the base version with a 19-second cooldown, so yeah, you can imagine. When it comes to basic multiplayer, it's starting to get into more expensive spell territory, but it can still have situational use if you're fighting a faction that doesn't have access to much or any healing and has heavy infantry as one of their win conditions. The problem here comes from the current Winds of Magic system in multiplayer, where it can be punishing if you bring the spell and misuse it, or just bring it, honestly, without a power generating caster. Campaign, single player and head-to-head, sure, it's really good. Standalone multiplayer? Very rarely. Final verdict. Amazing on both campaign types, very situational multiplayer. 2 skulls. And now we're moving on to the second damaging spell in this lore, Sakhmet's Incantation of the Skullstorm. Skullstorm has a base cost of 11 Winds of Magic with a 27-second duration and a 49-second cooldown. Honestly, it's about as much as you can expect from a Vortex. Completely random after the initial cast, with its pathing, and coincidentally, with its damage. Skullstorm will absolutely annihilate low armored units, it's not even funny. It does pretty fine against high armor targets too. Overcasting it for 17 wins will only increase its hitbox. This is absolutely disgusting on the campaign if you can pin down a bunch of enemy units with a tank character and just unleash the Skullstorm into the blob. Another benefit of the Skullstorm in general is its long duration for a Vortex, regardless of the casting type. The final upgrade makes it cost 9 wins base with a 28-second cooldown, while Overcast drops to 15 wins with the same 19-second cooldown, so go ahead, make the enemy blob up and spam Skullstorms to your desiccated heart's desire. When it comes to multiplayer though, Skullstorm is a massive wildcard, which is just not worth bringing due to its unreliability, and it's getting into the expensive spell territory. Winds of Magic power reserve and power generation is nowhere near as reliable as it is in the campaign, so this is a gigantic resource drain, especially Overcast. Unless, you're fighting somebody who will actually blob, then by all means go ahead and coin flip. Final verdict. Potentially amazing in single player, which can make it 3 out of 3 skulls there. However, it's not as good in head-to-head campaigns and definitely not in regular multiplayer, so overall it'll be 1 out of 3 skulls. The final spell of the lore, Usekph's Incantation of Desiccation, is a monstrous debuff. For 15 wins baseline, it'll reduce the enemy's melee attack and defense by 24 for 38 seconds. The stat debuff is decent enough, but the duration is what really seals the deal here. This spell allows your units to completely turn around even or losing matchups, and this is taking into account no outside interference. As an example, Nehekhara warriors will destroy battle pilgrims, while Tomb Guard will actually beat the Great Weapon Chaos Warriors or annihilate Foot Squires and Saurus Warriors. Fully upgraded on the campaign, it drops to 13 wins cost and 25 seconds cooldown for the normal version, and I don't even have to tell you how brutal this is. The Overcast version costs a massive 21 wins, 19 with campaign skills, and it increases the melee attack debuff further to 40, while the cooldown remains the same, 51. Essentially, this incantation cripples factions that don't have access to a reliable AoE attack buff, and it lets Tomb King infantry actually smash the enemy and become the win condition sometimes. Also, your chariots, melee Ushapti, or other win conditions will also greatly benefit from the reduced melee defense. You get the point. Disgustingly effective on the campaign, and pretty good in both types of multiplayer as long as you time it correctly. It has a pretty high cost though, so yeah, you're paying for pretty much half a skeleton unit for one spell that can completely turn around the game. Honestly, just use it smartly and you have a game-winning spell. Final verdict, bring it in single player, bring it in head-to-head, and bring it in multiplayer. 3 out of 3 skulls. Overall, the Lore of Nehekhara is in a weird spot. The buffs are highly situational and affect only one target, so you have to be precise with their usage if you want to get the most out of them when it comes to pure damage value, and the same can be said for Usirian's Incantation. Limited to one target, and it's a surgical tool. The Vortex is decent, and Usekph's Incantation is absolutely game-changing. Even though it's nowhere near the destructive potential of Death and Shadows or the well-rounded Lore of Light, it's still a pretty solid support lore, and I would always recommend having at least one Lore of Nehekhara Lich Priest in your army on the campaign. As you'll see in my next guide, which is dropping surprisingly quick, the Tomb Kings just have no problem running multicaster lists and swimming in that sweet magic. As for multiplayer, it really mostly depends on the matchup and your lord. If you're taking Ptra, it would be kinda dumb to bring a Nehekhara Lich Priest. However, if you're using Archon as an example, you can bring one for, let's say, Desiccation and Djaf, and equip him with Nefera's Scroll for more power generation, while Archon is just chilling there with Spirit Leech in his items. And that's it for the Lore of Nehekhara. A decent supportive lore which turns the units into the carries instead of carrying by its own sheer destructive force. Will this get changed? Only time will tell. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's just the start of this series, so feel free to comment on which lore of magic you would like to see me cover next, and hey, maybe throw in a like or two for the Nehekharan gods. And until the next time, I'm just gonna leave you with Carrion, because you know what? I think vultures are cool and they're a Tomb King thing, so yeah, have fun staring at vultures.